Hey everybody, with Dragonflight now a couple months old, I thought this would be a good time for us to do a little bit of review on whether or not Dragonflight has delivered in Mythic Plus. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the dungeons, we're going to take a look at the gearing systems, the dungeon difficulty, and the overall class balance, and we're going to give Dragonflight Mythic Plus a grade. So let's get into it. Let's start with the dungeon pool itself. So we're looking at the 8 Mythic Plus dungeons, including the old returning ones, not the 8 Dragonflight dungeons as a whole. So starting with the new 4, Ruby Life Pools, Azure Vault, Naka Defensive, and Algathar Academy. I really like all 4 of these. They're all unique visually and have their own identity. Naka is a very open world dungeon where you fly around on your dragon mount and have tons of choices to how you want to approach things. Ruby Life Pool is kind of the exact opposite, sort of a cramped, fiery, yet pretty dragon dungeon where it feels like all hell's breaking loose around you and offers some really challenging content from a healer standpoint. Azure Vault is distinctly blue dragon themed with some really cool bosses, and Algathar Academy, also known as Hogwarts, is also just really pleasant to look at and allows for some player choice as far as boss order goes. I'd rate all 4 of these dungeons really highly. As for the returning dungeons, Halls of Valor, Court of Stars, Shadowmoon Burial Grounds, and Jade Serpent. Halls of Valor is an interesting one. I think it's a really cool and classic dungeon. However, because of its length and the amount of RP involved, it's something I'd more often like to do like every once in a while than have it be in a rotation for an entire season. Court of Stars is definitely my favorite of these old returners. There's a lot to think about in COS from a strategy standpoint, and the various items on the ground make for very different experiences. As a big fan of Legion, it's also just really cool to see Suramar again and watch Melandris get yelled at. Yet another failure, Melandris. Looking at Jade Serpent again from a healer biased standpoint, the bosses really kind of take you through the gauntlet of things a healer needs to be able to do: execute mechanics, standstill, throughput, tank healing, and debuff management. Definitely not the funnest dungeon in the pool in my opinion, with some downright annoying trash mechanics, but returning to Mop in any sense is a win for me. Finally, Shadowmoon Burial Grounds, with all the dungeons being in this sort of happy, naturey outdoor places from an aesthetic point of view, it's kind of nice for us to go into a dingy cave for a while, I guess. Kind of forgettable experience really though, mainly due to how easy it is compared to everything else. Overall, I think the dungeon pool is one of the highlights of the expansion and the M+ experience, and I'm going to give it an A-. On to the gearing systems for M+. Pretty obvious trend over recent expansions is the popularity of Mythic Plus and the feeling that many players are starting to prefer M+ to rating. I'm going to take a very biased stance on this here, but this is my 2 cents. I've rated every tier since Molten Core except for 1, but this tier I decided I was going to take a break from rating. I hadn't been enjoying it that much, and I just prefer Mythic Plus a lot better, so I decided to completely stop rating. And with the addition of the Creation Catalyst in Shadowlands and its return in Dragonflight, gear scaling up to plus 20s, I felt like I could stomach maybe missing out on a couple nice raid trinkets and a few item levels to cut rating out of my life and spend more time doing what I enjoy most in the game. So how did that work out for me? This is pretty subjective because we can argue over how big of an advantage raiders should get over Mythic Plus only players. I've heard the argument thrown out that if Mythic Plus players had access to everything raiders do, no one would raid. If that's true though, then doesn't Blizzard need to find ways to make raiding more fun so that so much of the player base doesn't view it as gear farming chores rather than a fun experience? I know a lot of people that love raiding or raid almost exclusively, so I don't think this is entirely true anyway. Raiders also have more chances at high item level gear per week and access to a wider variety of trinkets and weapons, often better ones. So even if M+ had an almost equal chance for tier, raiders would still hold a distinct advantage overall. So all that said, on to gearing systems. First of all, let's just call it like it is. The Catalyst has taken way too long to go live. I get that it can't go live while Race to World First is going on. So how's this for a Race to World First promotion? When the first guild kills the final boss, bam, the Catalyst is open for everyone and we all get our first piece of tier from it. Who's that hurting exactly? And if that's too early for some people, okay, but why are we waiting 6, 7, 8 weeks for this? Even when it finally goes live, the Catalyst is currently very restrictive in the first few weeks. Unless you're incredibly lucky with your vault, M+ players are going to be way behind raiders when it comes to tier. I'm going to ding the grade a little bit here because I think this was truly a misstep and I hope it gets corrected in future patches to whatever degree. Then we've got the new feature of gear scaling all the way up to plus 20. I'm actually a pretty big fan of this change personally, although I can understand why other people may not be. There's quite a difference between being able to run a 15 and being able to run a 20, and previously there wasn't much in-game incentive to run keys above a 15 once you had your dungeon ports or achievement, unless you're just a person who likes to push themselves for a higher score. This change makes gearing and running keys more important to do deeper into the season and awards players who are able to finish higher keys. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that not everyone wants to, or maybe is cut out to do plus 20 keys. So whether or not it's right to not allow those players access to the highest item levels of gear is definitely a matter of opinion. Finally, we have Valor points to talk about. I think Valor points are great, and I love the idea of them returning for Season 1. However, the Valor cap is extremely restrictive. I get that we don't want people who are able to run M+ 24/7 to completely pull out of reach from players who have limited time to play, and I am one of those people, by the way, but even someone with pretty limited time is likely to cap out their Valor really quickly. As it stands now, it could take weeks to attain enough Valor to upgrade some pieces to max level, and the score cap already acts as a preventative measure anyway. I'm not necessarily advocating for uncapped Valor right off the bat, but I think significantly raising the cap would be a good thing. So all in all, I'd say the gearing system has some ups and downs. Could use some work in some areas, especially with the Catalyst and Valor points. I'd really like to know exactly what Blizzard's goal is as far as being able to gear through M+ and Raid, because I get some mixed messages from them, so I'm going to give gearing a B-. So next on the agenda, we've got difficulty. First of all, it was clearly intentional on Blizzard's part to make M+ a little bit harder overall this time around. This was pretty apparent when they implemented the 40% health and damage changes toward the end of beta, saying healers had it too easy. In Dragonflight, mechanics are very unforgiving. There's a lot of one-shots and a ton of unavoidable damage going out compared to previous expansions. I know that might sound bad, but I actually kind of like it. As a healer main, it feels good to be possibly the most important cog in the group right now. I also think Blizzard has done a pretty good job with hotfixing and balancing the dungeons in terms of the trash and bosses week over week. Hotfixes have been mostly tweaks and not total overreactions, and I think the nerf to the Ancient boss in Algathar is just a great example of a good nerf where the boss wasn't gutted numerically, but the mechanics were rearranged so they could be executed the way it was intended. My gripe with difficulty actually comes from the ocean of difference between the easiest and hardest dungeons. There are always easier and harder dungeons in a pool, but I don't know if the difference has ever been this pronounced. Some keys allow for multiple wipes while others require a nearly perfect run to time. One thing I think Blizzard has been slow on is adjusting the timers to make this more uniform. Every dungeon should allow roughly the same amount of wiggle room for mistakes, and I do think there should be some. Otherwise, you get groups falling apart the instant something goes wrong, which is no fun for anyone. So for difficulty, I'm going to give this a B-. Finally, let's talk class balance. For context, if you're new or you haven't maybe played M+ much in the past, one tank, one healer, and a small handful of DPS always rise to the top as the meta. Even if the difference between all the specs was 0.1%, the community would find those specs that are 0.1% ahead, and that's what you would see all over the top of Raider.io. There's no avoiding that. And if we're going to have variety between classes and specs, some are just going to be better at 5-man content. I'm not asking for a tier list where everything is A tier. That isn't possible. But I think we're seeing some cases lately where, given the difficulty of higher keys especially, more specs are just not competitive at all than usual, which excludes people, and that's not good. Speaking as a healer specialist a bit here, but at least from the healer point of view, we have classes that can perform and specs that simply can't. I'm coming in with a big fat C- for class balance. It could be lower, but I'm not as familiar with the disparity for DPS specs in particular. I just know that when I look at sub creation lately, I see a lot of specs that are down in the F tier and just completely left out of the higher end Mythic Plus game, and that's what we don't want. So the overall grade, not an average mind you, just my personal experience with Dragonflight Mythic Plus. I really enjoyed this season maining Preservation Evoker and playing my Resto Druid as an alt, so playing those classes I've admittedly not had to deal with balance issues too much outside of some gripes about maybe gearing and the timers on some dungeons. Had a generally positive experience. I'm going to give my overall M+ grade for Season 1 a B, so super solid with some room for improvement. So that's my grades for Dragonflight Mythic Plus now. That's based on my experiences. Your experiences might be a lot different, so I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments section. What do you guys think of these grades? What would your grade for Dragonflight be? And as always, if you enjoyed the video and you made it this far, I always appreciate a thumbs up on the video, subscribe to see more of my content in the future, or check me out live here on YouTube on stream Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, 9 p.m. Pacific. Love to see you there. Do lots of fun healing stuff. And until the next one, happy healing.